Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session titled Innovation, Economics, and Effective Altruism. I think it is not a stretch to say that there are very few academics in the world that are better placed to speak about the intersection of those themes than our speaker today, economics professor at the University of Chicago and 2019 Economics Nobel Laureate, Michael Kremer. As you might guess, his list of accomplishments is way too long for me to do justice right now, but among them is being a co-founder and scientific director of USAID's Development Innovation Ventures. Dr. Kremer has worked on AMC's advanced market commitments for pneumococcal vaccines that have gone on to save over 700,000 lives, and done some amazing work on deworming interventions that have been received by hundreds of millions of children per year in countries like India. So we'll welcome Dr. Kremer to the stage in just a sec. I want to remind you that one of the best perks you have being here in person compared to the folks on YouTube in the future is being able to interact with the Q&A. So I would encourage you to open up SwapCard right now, click on this session and the little live interaction button. You can put your questions there as you think of them during the talk, and also upvote other questions so I know which ones to ask first in the Q&A. Okay, let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming Michael Kremer.
I'd like to talk about innovation for global development, and I'm going to argue that there's tremendous potential for a variety of types of innovation, but I'll probably focus primarily on artificial intelligence. I think that it's potential for innovation, AI in particular, to improve the lives of people in low and middle income countries and really to have transformative impact. But realizing that potential really depends on the incentives and the institutions we create to shape both the direction and the pace of technological change. And it will also depend on creating appropriate social innovations to accompany those technological innovations, and in fact, creating appropriate social innovations to guide the development of technology. And I think there's a lot of attention in the effective altruism community to addressing some of the risks of AI, as there should be. I think it also makes sense for us to be thinking very intensively about where are there gaps between the social need for certain types of innovation and the commercial incentives for firms to develop them and distribute them. And where there's a big gap between the two, then that's an area where effective altruists and others can work in a variety of ways, whether that's by financially supporting that type of innovation, or if you've got the skills directly working on that type of innovation, if you're working for the government of a developing country, trying to think about what you can do in a role as a policymaker, et cetera. Also, I think one of the things that you mentioned, Development Innovation Ventures, that was a grant-making entity within USAID, and we took a look at the innovations that we supported, and we looked at which ones of those scaled. And one of the key factors, perhaps blindingly obvious, was cost. Low-cost innovations are much more likely to scale. And I think one of the reasons why I'm optimistic about artificial intelligence is I think there are some low-cost innovations, and that makes them much easier. The big spenders, we're obviously all, those of us in the field are all, very concerned about the huge cutbacks in development cooperation budgets, the end of USAID, the cutbacks in Europe as well. But we should remember that the vast majority of development spending comes from governments and people of low and middle income countries, and firms there as well. And that, that's really what drives development. So if there are ways to improve the efficiency of that expenditure through innovation, which is about getting more output for the same input, or that really should be a source of optimism. But we have to ensure that the innovation serves that goal. Okay, I'm going to let me start. I'll try to start out with just a historical example showing how the incredible role of innovation for human welfare. I'll give a health example. Then I'll give an example of, we think continues to be a very important category, which is other health innovations, some of which has nothing to do with AI, so I'll talk about that. And then I'll talk about an AI innovation that I've been working on now. And I'll at the conclusion, I'll just mention a few other areas without going into any depth, and that'll be speculative, but just to give a sense. I'm going to focus on innovations that for governments, because I think that tends to be one of, tools of economic theory helps us identify cases where there's a big gap between the social need for an innovation and commercial incentives. So one obvious category is if there are innovations that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there may not be a lot of market for that, but there's huge social benefits, so that would be one example. Another example is innovations to improve government services, because governments probably have some market power or monopsony power in buying those innovations. They can use that to hold the price down, or they can just say, thanks for developing that innovation. Now that you've shown it can be done, we're going to contract this out to another firm, and so it makes it not the most attractive area for private firms to invest in, but it's socially very important. So I think finding ways to support that type of innovation is one category of needed innovation. Okay, I'm inevitably going to focus on areas that I'm involved in and innovations I think are promising that I'm working on, but I think they're, I am excited about those, but I think there are many other examples as well. Okay, so let me start with just a historical example to show how powerful innovation is. And I think we should think about this as let me try, there we go, this is the impact of combined technological and social innovations. So if the blue dots here represent countries in 2016, and the orange dots represent countries in 1900. So the mortality rates on the vertical axis, GDP per capita is on the horizontal axis. And you can see that within each period, as GDP rises, mortality rates fall. But over time, the big change, it's partly the countries are getting richer, but it's primarily that the whole line is shifting. That for any level of GDP per capita, we are much healthier. So in Italy in 1900, 300 out of every 1,000 children died before their 5th birthday. In contemporary Kenya, 95% of children survive. If you think about the impact of that change for human welfare, it's obviously enormous. And that dramatic improvement isn't because Kenya today is richer than Italy in 1900. Actually, average incomes in Kenya today are actually slightly lower. It's primarily due to a combination of biomedical innovations, such as the development of antibiotics, vaccines, oral rehydration therapy, but also the social innovations that provide the vast majority of women and their children with access to prenatal care, attended delivery, essential health care. So, much of this innovation, we've already seen, if you take a long-run perspective, you can see the tremendous importance of innovation. For health, I think the same thing is true for material well-being, economic growth. With somewhat more complicated analysis, the same thing can be true for environmental progress as well. That's an example where the incentives that we create as a society are particularly salient. We can create incentives for innovation to support environmental progress, or we can create incentives that make the environment worse, for innovations to make the environment worse. But let me continue in talking about some examples of innovations that I'm excited about. Let me start with another health innovation, and this is inline chlorination. Okay. So as background, let me start with some data. This is from a meta-analysis. We found 19 studies these were typically studies of the impact of water treatment on diarrhea. Okay? One thing about, you can't patent chlorination, you can't patent some other basic approaches to water treatment. It takes a very large sample size to do a study on mortality. So even though mortality is the outcome probably we care most about, it hasn't been feasible to conduct studies looking at mortality typically. But what we did is we went back to the studies looking at diarrhea, and we contacted the authors and looked and asked them if there was any data. Some of them published some data on mortality, but others didn't. But we asked them, did they have any data on that? And this is an ongoing project, but the current state of things is that if we look at the 19 studies and we average across them, not a simple average, but a weighted average as with the appropriate statistical techniques, we find that all-cause child mortality, not mortality from water-related disease alone, mortality from all causes, falls 21%. Okay? That makes water treatment one of the most cost-effective health interventions available. Depending on the delivery method and the context, $30 up to $200 per disability life year adjusted. Now, new studies will come. I'm sure this will move around a lot. This doesn't adjust for compliance. That's a little tricky to do. It was measured differently in different studies. I hope that in the future, as new studies come out, we'll keep an updated website, and eventually we'll address the compliance issue and a number of other issues. But I think this is such a dramatic difference that I think our best estimate of the impact of water treatment on child mortality still likely to yield very, very cost-effective, the finding that's very cost-effective. Now, how do you go from something like this to thinking about how are you actually going to deliver, or how can governments deliver, or societies more generally deliver clean water? Well, there's a variety of approaches. Let me talk about one, which is inline chlorination. So inline chlorination devices, let me find my paper notes here. The inline chlorination devices attach to piped water systems, and they automatically chlorinate water. So if you think about that picture of a water tank that I showed before, where there's a water tank for a village or something like that, it's quite easy to attach them. And then water is treated automatically for everybody using that source. There are a range of different devices out there. Some don't require electricity. They're broadly compatible with piped water infrastructure. A randomized trial from Bangladesh found 69% of samples were successfully treated, and pretty big reductions in diarrheal index, in child illness. Okay, so let me see if I can explain something here. There are little tablets of chlorine that get stacked in this tube. And as the water goes through, it dissolves those, and it's designed to be pretty precise. And then the next tablet just drops down by gravity. It's very, very inexpensive. If you buy a bottle of bleach, it's enough chlorine in there to treat 70,000 liters of water, although I wouldn't recommend using chlorine. I would recommend using chlorine. I would not recommend using bleach. It's a little bit too high a concentration to precisely dilute. Okay, so one of the reasons why I'm excited about this is that the government of India just had a national program, something what they call a mission in India, which is sort of a very high priority national effort. This is equivalent of a campaign promise in some ways by Modi. I'm going to give every household in the country, even rural households, or particularly rural households, piped water that's going to go to their house. And they spent $40 billion on this. Okay, so when you're thinking about, cuts to aid budgets, the government of India is by far a more important development spender than any, the US or France or the UK. When they spent $40 billion on this, but water quality is still a challenge because they focused on connecting up the households to water. That was the focus of the program. The documents all say the water is supposed to be safe, but many of the villages don't have actually functioning systems to treat water, and there's high rates of E. coli contamination, at least from the data that we have. So once you've installed a piped water system, and you saw just one piece, the tank, but you can imagine installing piped water to everybody's household. That's expensive. Putting on that little device and buying chlorine, that's a tiny add-on. That's something that a developing country government, or at least in a lower middle income country like India, that's something that they can afford to do. But to figure out how to do that requires a fair amount of working out the details. Well, exactly which devices do you use in which situations? How do you get the refills done? How do you get the maintenance done? These aren't at all trivial issues. We conducted a pilot. We actually had a meeting, shared the evidence from the meta-analysis, the compilation of RCTs, with the secretary, the top civil servant in this for this $40 billion program, and she was immediately convinced that they should do this. But of course, after a process of piloting and testing, so they lots of approvals, as is appropriate for a government. So we helped conduct some piloting, and others, the NGO Evidence Action, did a lot of this. And both in our study and in their work, we found basically positive result. And some of this work was in a state, Orissa. That state government is now, based on that, is considering a phase scale. But at the national level, they're also developing guidelines for including this in the national program, and are moving forward with it as well. Now, there are also a bunch of implementation challenges. And I'm not going to go through the detail of them. I probably have a few too many slides. But there are issues that are still that are identified when you pilot something. Then you have to work through and find ways to address them. And partly that'll be about social innovations and monitoring systems and how you write the contracts for the firms that do this work when the government has to procure this work from private firms. Partly it could be some technological innovations as well. Okay. Let me turn to, but I think this is an example of, if clean water could be provided to huge parts of India that now have piped water but not clean water, it's one estimate is, over 100,000 lives could be saved every year. Right? That's, rough back of the envelope calculation. And I think that's something that is doable. Let me turn to another area, and this is one where AI technology, I think, can play a key role. And that's digital agriculture. I'm going to focus in particular on the case of weather forecasts, which could be delivered digitally, but also other ways. And in particular, on AI weather forecasts. So as a little bit of background, I chaired a commission on innovation for climate change, food security, and agriculture. And we reviewed the evidence from a bunch of innovations for evidence of impact and cost effectiveness, not just for the innovation itself, does the seed lead to higher yield, but also for, are there cost effective ways to use it? Will farmers actually use it? And we recommended a whole host of innovations, happy to talk about others. But high on the list were digital agriculture and weather forecasts within that. So I'll summarize some of the evidence, but let me give you from our literature review. But first, let me give you a little bit of background. So farmers, as might be obvious, but farmers need to make a bunch of decisions for which weather information can be valuable. I lived in Kenya for a while. A key decision there is there are rainy seasons and dry seasons, 2 rainy seasons a year in this part of Kenya. You want to plant as soon as possible after the rainy season starts, because that gives you a long growing season and it will give you a better harvest. But you don't want to plant too soon, because if you plant and the rainy season hasn't really arrived, if it's sort of a false onset, well, then the seeds don't germinate and you lose the seeds. You might lose the land preparation activity. You lose any fertilizer that you put in there. It can be really financially disastrous for a farmer. So, farmers tend to be conservative and wait probably longer than makes sense on average from a purely profit-maximizing agriculture perspective, but they need to be risk-averse. So it's not irrational. And the problem's getting harder because climate change is making weather in general harder to predict. And in particular, it affects the timing of seasons. So the good news is that there's really and I'll go through these points in a little bit more detail, but let me sort of say a little bit about the revolution in AI weather forecasting that's happening. So, we've seen sort of steady progress in weather forecasting for, decades. It's gotten better and better, but, at a measured pace. There's suddenly, people were aware that AI models might be able to do this, but they thought it was quite a way out. Well, in the past few years, like 3 years, they've gone from, well, maybe this will make it be useful down the road, to they're now outperforming, for many purposes, the traditional models, numerical weather prediction models. There are many companies now with open access AI weather models, like Google has 3 of them, NVIDIA, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, which is probably the premier global weather forecasting center. Fudan University in China has the Fuxi model. It goes on. Okay? These models, because of the greater, they not only are more accurate, but they can predict out at longer timelines. So they, as a rough rule of thumb, used to be you could predict 10 days out, now you can predict 15 days out. I'm greatly oversimplifying. They run much, much faster. So the old weather models, you needed supercomputers. These ones you can run on laptops. Partly because of that, they can be easily tailored to farmer needs. So, if I get a forecast, typical forecast I click on first says probability of rain during the day. I ride a bike, I don't really care about that. I care about, the 15-minute window I need to get to work. When can I ride and avoid the rain? If you're a farmer, you have your own needs. Like, are the rains going to start? And will it be followed by a dry spell? And, depending on the crop, you can define the period of time that you're worried about the dry spell. So you could tailor the forecast for that, and potentially you could optimize the model, not for global weather or for, the things meteorologists typically, wind patterns up in the atmosphere, but for the thing that the farmer cares about in a particular context. Okay, so that means there's huge potential for this, and I'm just going to show you later what can be done with at a very basic level. One thing that a team of researchers in India, at the University of Chicago, at Berkeley, did was we just took these out-of-the-box models produced that I referred to earlier. They're open access. And we checked how well do they do at predicting the monsoon in India. And what we found was that they actually are quite good for the monsoon. You can predict much further in advance. There are useful predictions 30 days out. And these were the areas, I'll explain more, but these are the areas where they did particularly well within India. And there were two models. The European model, one of the Google models, did particularly well, and we find a way to blend them. Okay. Okay. So let me just go back to this. So that's some background on weather forecasting. Let me go through that's item one. But let me go through these other items. Farmers respond to digital advisory. And that's true. Digital agricultural advice can be on a host of topics. I'm not going to go through everything, every list, but most of these tests are with very basic messages, SMS messages. People get lots of spam. Lots of farmers are ignoring them. So the results I'm going to show are for the subset of, the overall effects. So that would include a bunch of farmers who don't see things. Okay, so these are a bunch of RCTs on weather forecasts. And what they basically all show is that farmers change their behavior. And they change different dimensions of their behavior depending on the particular agricultural system and particular type of forecast. The third one here is how farmers change in response to monsoon forecasts. You change your planting date, but you can also change which crops, which varieties you're planting, how much land you plant, et cetera. Okay? Here's a set of things on pest outbreaks. So, weather information, you want that has to be delivered in a timely way. That has to be delivered for a particular geographic region. That's very good for digital delivery. Same with pest outbreaks. Okay, this is it's related to weather. It's a weather model. Based on the weather, you can tell, is this ripe conditions for a pest? If it is, then you want to, if there's not going to be the pest, you want to invest more, and they found substantial yield gains from that. The adoption of new seeds. Which seeds should you adopt? That will vary. Or you can provide information, then farmers can choose that appropriately, not just about weather, but other issues. Soil type. A lot of farmers don't know does their soil need nitrogen? Does it need some other nutrient? So they may overuse some types of fertilizer, underuse others. If you can get people soil information, they're more likely to use the appropriate inputs. Market linkages. So this was a study I was involved in. This was with a big buyer. They were of sugarcane. They were supposed to deliver fertilizer to farmers, but they were often late. So this wasn't the farmers getting the information. It was farmers complaining about late delivery or non-delivery, and that really improved the performance of the company. Or in Uganda, Microsoft Research and a Ugandan research institution created a product that allowed traders to communicate with each other, to set up trades. That led to more trades, reduced that spatial arbitrage, reduced dispersion in prices, and that could be very important for food security. For public service delivery, there's evidence that the right digital systems can really improve the performance of extension workers, of public sector veterinarians, et cetera. Okay? So perhaps unsurprisingly, given those impacts, when these are implemented at scale, they have very high benefit cost ratios. So, I'll take the example of the soil chemistry results. The absolute effects were pretty modest, but given the low cost of messages, they were enough to give very high benefit cost ratios at scale. This digital advisory services in Orissa in India that had how you deal with weather emergencies. I think this is, they found some gains on average, but particularly high gains in the parts of the state that had excess rainfall. The weather forecast ones, it varies depending on the weather conditions. Some cases, well over $100 per farmer. Other cases, much smaller or hard to find. Let me talk about this India case to give you some sense of the potential gains. The government of India has 100 million farmer phone numbers. The cost, India has very low data rates, but they could send messages. Sending the messages costs about a penny per farmer. Easy for the government of India to pay for that. So in 2024, they provided messages with some technical assistance from University of Chicago team, but also from Precision Development, where I think somewhere on the slide it says I should acknowledge I'm a board member there, disclose that. But they provided information to 9 million farmers. In 2025, they're bringing in these open access, the forecasts based on these open access AI models, and they're delivering that to 40 million farmers. Now you can see that, I think it's easy to get a sense of the potential benefits from this, but let me just try to walk through a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation. And I wouldn't take this as more than a back of the envelope calculation, but of what this could, mean. So, I mentioned the range of estimates. I think it's, reasonably safe to think that the benefits might be, say, $5 to $10 per farmer. I think that's, actually probably a bit conservative. This reached, if we just take this year, if this reaches 40 million farmers, that's $200 million to $400 million in benefits. The costs of this, generating the forecasts, hard to say, there are different grants, et cetera. Maybe, and this isn't just generating the forecasts, this is building the benchmark system. So it's a fixed cost that can be used in future years as well. $1 million, let's say. The marginal costs, probably a penny per farmer, but say if you average the cost over, just for dissemination, certainly the whole cost is less than 5 cents per farmer. So if you've got benefits in the $5 to $10 range, if you've got costs in the 5 cents per farmer or less range, enormous benefit cost ratio, almost all of that excess is going to be benefits. And that's with 40 million farmers. If you imagine that the government, central government has 100 million phone numbers, states often have many more phone numbers, and this was just monsoon onset forecasts. You could get forecasts throughout the year. It's easy to imagine tripling the size of this and doubling the impact. Then you're easily talking about billions and billions of dollars of estimates. Easy to see $1.2 to $2.4 billion in annual benefits, and this could be year after year. The cost of this, of setting this up, it's, the innovation that's required to do this is fairly modest. I don't want to minimize all the work that went into it. A huge amount of work went into it by a team of people. And you also have to think through how do you deliver those messages and do A/B tests on it. But this type of effort, I think, shows what AI can do in a way that really can be scaled by governments. And then, I think, with some further investments, it's possible to scale this further. So let me highlight 2 types of catalytic further investments. Engaging with multilateral development banks, which often look very seriously at the evidence, and potentially with certain types of private sector firms that are capable of free distribution. I don't think sort of a startup that's charging for the forecast, I don't think that'll work. Happy to say that in Q&A. But we worked with the Asian Development Bank. They heard about what the government of India was doing. They've announced plans to invest $300 million in weather forecasts. We're working with them we have an MOU with them to help develop concept notes for loans to Bangladesh, India, Bangladesh, Laos, and they're planning another round, which would include Pakistan and Indonesia and a number of other countries. The Inter-American Development Bank's committed $280 million for this. There's some a donor called Ag Fund and another called Badea announced support for a project in Ethiopia to reach 10 million farmers. And And we're in earlier stage discussions with the World Bank about several other countries. I think you can see this becoming that if developing innovations for governments, getting them adopted by governments, then working with the international system to spread this is something that can, lots of efforts will fail, but if there's success, their occasional successes will pay for all of that. Okay. I also think, and this is just a bullet point, and I probably shouldn't spend too much time on it, but I think the private sector, some types of private sector, telco firms, social media firms, tech firms, traditional media firms could scale this, and it could perhaps even more rapidly. But you need that catalytic investment. They're not going to develop the forecast. They're not going to A/B test the messages for farmers. Okay, let me speed up but when governments, I don't want to, just to come back to the complications. When governments design systems, digital agriculture systems, they're very often hard for farmers to use. But if some basic techniques that are standard in the private sector, some funnel analysis, where a farmer is getting stuck in the voice menu system, press 1 for this, press 2 for that, and then some A/B tests to try and alleviate that, that's standard. Any big company would get that analysis done for its voice menu system. But this developing country or low-income country government, they didn't do that. But when that was brought in as a service for them, they paid attention to the results and they changed their system. Same thing's true in many other contexts. Okay, there are A/B tests on weather that suggest a lot of important lessons. Okay, I think this gives, I've focused on the content side of what AI can do, but I think much more could be done on that. It can be done globally. It can be done over longer timescales. It can be done to predict not just agriculturally important variables, but also there's an enormous number of heat deaths forecast from climate change. If people could be given warnings about this, and tomorrow's going to be a hot day, maybe, don't bring the baby to the field, or here are the symptoms of heat stroke. If you see these developing, then get out of the sun and drink some water. Those could potentially help address some of that. You can have soil moisture models, et cetera. I won't go through. Making this work will probably require that these all be done in an open access way so that governments and farmers can use them. Okay? But let me turn to the communication side with LLMs. The government of India has an enormous set of agricultural advisories. Every weather condition, every district, every crop. This is for internal government use about what agriculture departments should advise farmers to do. You probably can't see this, but even if you could, it's not written in a way that farmers could understand. It's not intended for farmers. It's intended for agriculture experts. But you could train an LLM with some experts to try to convert these to messages that could go to farmers. And that could potentially, I think that's a quick win. I mean, you need the experts, but if you can start doing that type of thing, then you could produce that at scale. But the real transformative potential would be if each farmer could get a chatbot that would give them individualized, personalized advice on all the issues they have to deal with in agriculture. And then if you could get information from the farmers, not just send information to the farmers, but let's say there's a new seed variety. Well, you know how well it works on an agricultural research station, but maybe you could distribute that to some farmers, and then they could do an on-farm trial, one plot with one seed variety, another with another, and report that. I have no idea whether that would work. I'm sure it wouldn't be easy. But if you could start doing things like that, that advances the whole R&D system. Okay, you could get, there's some very recent papers with incredibly phenomenally impressive results on behavioral interventions. This is one from Zambia. there's one harvest a year. Farmers have trouble saving enough to finance the next season's inputs. A simple infographic tool saying, how much do you need to save for each of a bunch of different categories? People realize they need to save more than if you just say, how much do you need to save for the year? That presented the increased savings by 15%, and that wound up increasing the next year's yield by 9%, or revenues. That type of thing, that was with a one-time intervention, delivered by a human. But imagine that throughout the year you had a chatbot going. Well, how's that saving efforts going? Were you running into problems? Have you thought about this? Have you some encouragement? That could potentially yield much bigger impacts than this. So I think there's a lot of exciting potential. I promised that I would raise a couple of areas. I won't talk about them much, but other areas in education. I think having a human teacher, there's a lot of effort on developing AI software for people who are super motivated, who want to use that as learners themselves for students. Probably many of you have gone to Khan Academy and done things like that, and that's great. But a lot of students are going to have trouble. If you're the typical fourth grader in a low-income country, you may need the social environment of a school and of a teacher and of classmates. So developing lesson plans for teachers. So one thing that's been found very effective is something called structured pedagogy. That's a system of lesson plans that incorporate sort of the latest phonics, et cetera. But then you need coaching for the teachers, et cetera. A lot of that maybe someday could be done by AI. You could take the curriculum of the country, you could take the best principles of the latest research in education about child-centered education, phonics, et cetera, and create at least a first draft of a lesson plan, of textbooks. Maybe you could even have software to help coach teachers as well in that. Health, I think it's obvious that the potential of AI health software is huge, but you're going to have to design a somewhat different product to make it work in a lower middle income country environment. That won't be done without specific effort for it. Even so-called structural things, corruption. Perhaps the canonical paper on corruption in the academic literature is one on driver's licenses in India. People don't even go for the test on the driver's license. They make a payment and they just to an intermediary and the test, and they get their driver's license. Well, Microsoft Research developed some software that sits on the car and records everything the driver does, and several Indian jurisdictions have decided to incorporate that for their driver's license test. And you see the pass rate on the exam plummets after they put that in. And we've done a little bit of analysis of some data, and it looks like that's actually leading to better driver behavior, at least in the short run. I don't want to exaggerate the impact of that. But if you thought about, I think could have much bigger impact if you had cameras to look at traffic behavior, and if you get the police, the police in many countries, they may stop you for a bribe whether or not you committed a violation, and you pay a small bribe if you did commit the violation. Well, if this were caught by a traffic camera, analyzed by AI, and your license number was recorded, and any police officer could stop you, well, paying a bribe to one traffic officer wouldn't help. You'd have to pay over and over again. So you'd probably just say, hey, I have to pay the fine. Well, long run, if that led to a situation in which the motives to go into the police were not all the bribes you can get, but other features, maybe that would have very important structural implications. So I think these are just some examples of the potential of innovation. I think people here, if you have opportunities to get involved in this, I think it's worth doing so. And I think that's a way that eventually, if we create the right social institutions so that to create this type of innovation, it could have a tremendous impact on lives of people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kremer. We have time for just a couple of questions. And I wonder if we can start with one that you probably have just more inside view on than most people, which is how these massive projects actually unfold in the real world. So you mentioned this example of the $40 billion JJM mission in India.
Yeah.
You found yourself talking to the minister in charge of that.
Yeah.
How did that come to be? Did they reach out to you directly? Are they putting out a big request for proposal? Or did you somehow hear about this project and sort of proactively say, hey, there's probably an intervention here that you might not be thinking of?
So let me break this into two pieces.
Sure.
Yeah, the $40 billion project, I have nothing to do with that whatsoever. That was, Modi's a very smart politician. Part of the way he keeps getting reelected is he actually, I'm told by people who know Indian politics, is, lots of controversial things, but he delivers stuff, infrastructure to and other stuff to households, and that's why he's done very well among women, for example. So he knew that this is something you would get political credit for. I mean, he may have believed in it as well. I can't look into what motivated him. But there's plenty of reasons why politicians are going to, make some choices. But then he wants the project to be done well. He appoints a very capable civil servant to run it. Well, civil servants in India are, they're it's very, very selective to get that position. There's been lots of training efforts from JPAL and others. They're not all of them, but many of them are responsive to evidence. Yeah, I was able to, I now have incredible access, and so I was able to get the appointment to share the evidence, but there are other cases where there are plenty of other cases where governments adopt evidence.
Would you say that there's a structural change that might be worth trying to push on there? Do you think it's likely that this government would have been looking as far and wide as they could for interventions like this one, or could it have gone missed if you hadn't?
That's a great point. So a number of countries have been setting up government innovation units to deliberately think about can they systematically start exploring policy alternatives and rigorously testing them and adopting things that work. So, Chile, for example, has such a unit, and somebody in the lab who helped set that up and used to run that, somebody in the Development Innovation Lab at the University of Chicago, is now talking to a bunch of other countries in Latin America, and they're very interested in doing this. JPAL has close cooperation with the state of Tamil Nadu and in India. IPA has, I think they call them embedded labs. There's a number of efforts along these lines. And then, another area, and Development Innovation Ventures had open call for proposals for anybody who had ideas. That no longer exists, but hopefully some replacements for that will come along. And in the meantime, France has FID, which Esther Duflo and Pascaline Dupas are very involved in, which is doing great work along similar lines.
That's good to hear. Hopefully we'll see more of this adopted worldwide soon. I guess that makes it all the more relevant to ask then, are there downsides to having these sort of tech-enabled innovations rolled out widely? So Dr. Toby Ord is in the audience, and he gave an interesting example of how perhaps if you give these AI forecasts to every farmer in a particular region, now their behavior is going to be extremely correlated. And if that forecast goes wrong, maybe you have some catastrophic failure that would have been smoothed out otherwise.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of issues that need to be thought through. And I think there will be downsides. I don't think any technological change, is without some downside. I think it's important to pilot things, test them, to try to identify and mitigate, increase the upsides, decrease the downsides. Ultimately, it's the governments that, if this is a public sector innovation, it's the government that has to make the decisions about whether to do that. If it's a private sector adopted, then maybe it's individual firms and consumers, and the government is a regulator.
Makes sense. We have a question here that's going to ask you to put on your macroeconomics hat a bit here from Arthur Wright. He is mentioning that, advanced AI systems, some people predict, will lead to explosive economic growth, perhaps, 10% or more in some of these wilder forecasts, maybe within our lifetimes. And, feel free to comment on that or not, but I'm curious what you think the implications are for, faster growth in the developed world for low and middle income countries.
I, like 98% of economists and 2% of everybody else, I think that if there's faster growth in one part of the region, that's basically great for the rest of the world. If there's technological progress, a lot of that technological progress can diffuse. So I gave the example of, the incredible increase in lifespan in Kenya and in Italy. Well, those inventions did not primarily come from Kenya or from Italy. They were, those were, relatively small countries. They came from around the world, and each country benefited. So that's one channel. But also, export opportunities. How have countries mainly gotten rich in the post-World War II period? Well, a key factor has been exports, and finding some sector where you can export to the rest of the world. Well, if the rest of the world has more money, then they can get more of those imports. So I think it's would be very good for the whole world if some parts of the world get richer.
Nice.
I don't see this as zero sum at all. Yeah.
That's good to hear. Actually, speaking of that example of 1900 Italy versus Kenya in 2016. We had a question that was wondering if you would interpret that as evidence in general that focusing solely on GDP per capita or economic growth is maybe the wrong thing to pay attention to. And if so, are there other metrics besides sort of health that you might be liable to miss if you're sort of focused on that as an outcome?
Yeah, so on to that at a couple of levels in very limited time.
Sure.
Academic economists have this concept of welfare, and we think that it's welfare that should be maximized, certainly not GDP. So in day-to-day work of academic economists, we're not thinking about maximizing GDP. We're thinking about a broader measure of welfare. Of course, if you open the newspaper, you talk to politicians, they're focused on, they're often very focused on economic growth. For many purposes, I think that's exactly right. Long-run economic growth, I'm enough of a standard economist that I think, who did the most for development and poverty reduction? Deng Xiaoping, by moving from, we've got a Deng Xiaoping fan out there. But moving from, central, from the Great Leap Forward to complete, centralization of agriculture to some more market orientation, that put China on the path to where it is today and removed millions of people from poverty. And obviously, that's not to say, and we have to invest in redistribution and human capital and health and education and the environment. So I don't want to claim that's, we should only worry about growth, but yes, growth is really important.
Yeah.
Very old-fashioned position, but, I'll hold on to it.
It's stood the test of time for a reason, I suppose. Yeah. That's all the time we have for Q&A, but please join me one more time in thanking Dr. Kremer for excellent talk.